In the summer of 1940, Europe stood on the edge of collapse. Nations that had believed themselves unbreakable fell in weeks, armies that had marched proudly into the Low Countries vanished in fire and smoke along the roads of Flanders and Picardy. France, a great power of the continent, was defeated in a matter of days. The British Expeditionary Force escaped only by a miracle carved out of desperation on the beaches of Dunkirk. And across the Channel, the last free nation in Western Europe braced for the inevitable storm, a storm carried not by armored divisions or infantry columns, but by wings. What followed was more than a battle for territory or political supremacy. It was a struggle for survival, measured not in miles gained or lost, but in the endurance of a people and the resolve of a democracy that refused to bow. The Luftwaffe came with the confidence of swift victories, the Royal Air Force rose out of necessity, discipline, and courage that defied calculation. Above quiet fields and burning cities, the fate of a nation, and with it, the future of Europe, hung in the balance. This is the story of how Britain stood alone, and did not fall. The origins of the Battle of Britain and the events that led to Germany's air campaign against the United Kingdom cannot be understood in isolation from the sequence of military, political, and strategic decisions that unfolded across Europe in the months preceding the summer of 1940. The fall of Poland, the period known as the Phony War, and the rapid collapse of Western Europe in the spring of 1940 shaped the strategic landscape in which Germany contemplated Operation Sea Lion and sought to force Britain into capitulation through aerial domination. To understand why the Luftwaffe ultimately failed, and why Britain stood firm, one must begin with the systematic, chronologically grounded reconstruction of the German offensive in the West, Fall Gelb and Fall Rot, which extinguished the military strength of France, scattered the armies of the Low Countries, and forced the British Expeditionary Force into a desperate evacuation at Dunkirk. Only through documenting these events with precision, respect, and fidelity to archival sources can one grasp the profound significance of the Battle of Britain that followed. By the autumn of 1939, following Germany's invasion of Poland on September 1 and Britain and France's declarations of war 2 days later, the Western Front entered a period of uneasy quiet. Despite the existence of powerful standing armies along the Franco-German border, both sides hesitated to initiate offensive operations of any magnitude. French doctrine emphasized defensive combat, anchored on the Maginot Line, a fortified system that Paris trusted to deter or delay any major German advance long enough for France and its British ally to mobilize a counterstrike. The British Expeditionary Force, composed initially of 4 infantry divisions, expanded gradually as reinforcement units crossed the Channel, positioning themselves alongside French forces in northern France and Belgium. Germany, for its part, used the winter to regroup, integrate lessons from the Polish campaign, and refine operational planning for an offensive in the West. Within the German High Command, strategic disagreement emerged over how best to defeat France. General Franz Halder's early proposals for a direct thrust across central Belgium toward the French frontier resembled the German Schlieffen Plan-like concepts of 1914. Yet these plans relied on predictable avenues of attack, which the Allies expected and had prepared to counter. The breakthrough came through the intellectual intervention of General Erich von Manstein and the operational vision later championed by General Heinz Guderian. Manstein proposed a bold and unconventional assault. The main German effort would not strike where the Allies had anticipated in northern Belgium, but instead would push through the heavily forested and seemingly impassable Ardennes region, crossing the Meuse River at Sedan and other points. This operational maneuver aimed to cut off the bulk of Allied forces rushing into Belgium under the Dill Plan, envelop them, and break the strategic coherence of the Allied defensive system. Adolf Hitler came to support Manstein's plan early in 1940, appreciating its audacity and its potential to produce decisive outcomes. The German High Command revised its operational orders accordingly, forming Army Group A under General Gerd von Rundstedt as the main spearhead for the Ardennes assault. Army Group B under General Fedor von Bock was tasked with launching the initial feint into the Low Countries, while Army Group C maintained defensive positions opposite the Maginot Line. The Luftwaffe, commanded by Hermann Göring, prepared to support these operations through concentrated strikes on airfields, communication centers, bridges and troop concentrations. As winter turned to spring, German preparations accelerated. Armored divisions trained intensively for the rapid, coordinated advance required to make the Ardennes offensive successful. Engineers prepared bridging equipment for the Meuse crossings, while intelligence services gathered information on French defenses. Weather, logistics, and force readiness affected planning. The German attack was postponed multiple times, most notably after a German aircraft carrying classified documents crashed in Belgium in January 1940, briefly compromising elements of the plan. Nevertheless, the Allies misinterpreted the event and continued to expect a repeat of 1914 rather than the radically different operation that would begin in May. By early May 1940, some 3 million soldiers stood arrayed across the Western Front. The Allied forces, French, British, Belgian and Dutch, were numerous and possessed significant firepower, but their command structures were fragmented, communication channels cumbersome, and doctrinal approaches often outdated or mismatched with the tempo of modern mechanized warfare. France fielded strong armored forces, but many tanks were dispersed across numerous infantry formations, limiting their mobility and concentration potential. The Belgian and Dutch armies, though committed to resisting German aggression, relied heavily on fixed fortifications that could be circumvented or neutralized by airborne operations. On May 10, 1940, at dawn, Germany launched Fall Gelb. That morning, German airborne troops executed some of the first large-scale airborne assaults in history. Paratroopers captured strategic positions in the Netherlands, including key bridges and the fortress of Eben-Emael in Belgium, one of Europe's most formidable fortified positions. The speed and precision of these operations disoriented Dutch and Belgian defenders and disrupted their defensive networks. Meanwhile, German ground forces of Army Group B crossed into Luxembourg, Belgium and the Netherlands, advancing rapidly behind the airborne troops. The Dutch military resisted effectively in some regions, but the combined pressure of airborne assaults, armored forces and Luftwaffe bombing overwhelmed their defenses. Belgium, committed to resisting invasion, mobilized its forces to join the Allied effort. Yet the collapse of the fortress at Eben-Emael, a key defensive anchor along the Albert Canal, created a dangerous gap in the Belgian lines. The German Sixth Army exploited this breach, advancing deeper into Belgian territory with alarming speed. The Luftwaffe maintained air superiority over the Low Countries in the early days of the campaign, bombing roads, rail lines and airfields, which impeded the movement of Allied reinforcements and contributed to the growing sense of crisis among Allied commanders. As the Allied High Command, led by French General Maurice Gamelin, enacted the Dill Plan, large French and British forces pushed into central Belgium to meet the German advance. This movement, however, unfolded exactly as the German High Command had predicted. The bulk of Allied strength was pulled northward, away from the central point of vulnerability that would soon be exposed in the Ardennes. The Germans timed their movements precisely. While the Allies rushed into position in Belgium, Army Group A began its decisive drive through the Ardennes. The Ardennes region had been widely considered unsuitable for large-scale mechanized operations. The terrain, characterized by dense forests, narrow roads and rugged hills, seemed to preclude rapid tank movement. French military doctrine assumed that any attack through this region would be slow, vulnerable and ultimately containable. Yet the Germans deliberately exploited this assumption. Their armored divisions, led by Guderian, Hoth and Reinhardt, advanced in tight, disciplined columns through the region, moving with remarkable speed despite the bottlenecks and logistical challenges. The German advance through the Ardennes between the 10th and the 12th of May demonstrated extraordinary coordination between armor, infantry, engineers, and air support. By 12 to 13 May, German vanguard units reached the Meuse River near Sedan, Montherm and Dinant. The French Second Army, deployed in this sector, was under strength and unprepared for the scale and speed of the German assault. Luftwaffe dive bombers, Stukas, executed some of the most intense concentrated bombing raids of the campaign against French defensive positions near Sedan on May 13. Although the material damage inflicted was less than initially believed, the psychological shock was severe, contributing to the disintegration of French cohesion in the sector. Under the cover of these air attacks, German engineers launched assault boats across the Meuse, securing bridgeheads and enabling armored divisions to cross in force. The crossing of the Meuse marked a turning point in Fall Gelb. By 14 to 15 May, German armored columns poured through the breached French lines and began driving westward with extraordinary momentum. Their objective, in line with Manstein's plan, was to reach the Channel coast, cutting off Allied forces advancing into Belgium from the south. As German tanks and motorized infantry raced toward the interior of France, the French High Command struggled to respond. Communications broke down, command decisions were delayed, and attempts to mount counterattacks failed due to lack of coordination and the speed with which German armored units exploited every tactical advantage. The Netherlands, heavily pressured by airborne assaults, Luftwaffe bombing and rapid ground advances, surrendered on May 14 after the devastating bombing of Rotterdam. The destruction of civilian areas, although occurring amid miscommunication between German commanders and bombers already deployed for the attack, contributed to a rapid collapse of Dutch resistance. With the Netherlands removed from the conflict, German forces were able to redirect their focus toward Belgium and France. Meanwhile, the German breakthrough at Sedan continued to expand. Guderian's 19 Panzer Corps pushed rapidly toward the west, reaching the River Oise and beyond. French attempts to launch armored counterattacks, such as the engagement near Montcornet led by Colonel Charles de Gaulle, achieved temporary successes but were insufficient to halt the German advance. The Allies found themselves confronting a strategic catastrophe. The German armored wedge was driving deep into the rear of Allied forces concentrated in Belgium, threatening to encircle them entirely. By 16 to 17 May, the situation for the Allies worsened dramatically. German armored divisions advanced toward Amiens and then Abbeville, reaching the English Channel on May 20. This maneuver effectively cut off the British Expeditionary Force, along with several French and Belgian units, from the rest of the French army. The encirclement, though not yet complete in tactical terms, was strategically devastating. The BEF and its Allied counterparts were now caught in a rapidly shrinking pocket in northern France and Flanders. The Allied forces attempted countermeasures. British and French units launched operations to reopen the corridor to the south, engaging German positions near Arras on May 21. The British armor involved in the attack achieved surprising initial success, briefly halting the German advance and causing concern within the German High Command. However, the lack of coordinated infantry and artillery support prevented the attack from expanding, and German forces regrouped and repelled the assault. As the German armored spearheads consolidated their positions along the Channel coast, the encircled Allied forces faced increasing pressure from multiple directions. The Luftwaffe intensified bombing raids on Allied positions, supply lines and coastal towns. Belgian defensive lines along the Lys River strived to maintain cohesion, but the overall situation grew dire. Communications between French and British commands were strained, and logistical conditions deteriorated rapidly as German forces pressed their advance. By late May, the remaining path for Allied withdrawal, toward the coastal port of Dunkirk, became the focal point of both Allied defense and German offensive planning. The German High Command recognized the strategic opportunity to annihilate the encircled Allied armies, a prospect that would fundamentally alter the course of the war. Hitler, however, issued the controversial halt order on May 24, temporarily stopping the advance of German armored divisions near Dunkirk. The reasons remain debated among historians. Some attribute the decision to concerns over terrain unsuited for tanks, others to Göring's assurances that the Luftwaffe could destroy the pocket from the air, and still others to intercommand dynamics between Hitler, the Wehrmacht leadership and the SS. Whatever the combination of factors, the halt order allowed the Allies a critical window to organize a defensive perimeter around Dunkirk and begin preparations for evacuation. By May 26, Operation Dynamo, the evacuation of the encircled forces, began in earnest. The Royal Navy, supported by hundreds of civilian vessels, fishing boats, merchant ships and small craft famously dubbed the Little Ships, braved relentless bombardment to transport British and Allied troops from the beaches and harbour of Dunkirk to the relative safety of England. The evacuation was chaotic and dangerous, carried out under constant Luftwaffe attack. Yet it succeeded in rescuing more than 330,000 soldiers between May 26 and June 4. The retreat, though framed as a triumph of resilience, underscored the gravity of the Allied defeat in France. The BEF returned to Britain without most of its heavy equipment, artillery and vehicles, severely weakening its immediate operational capacity. While the Dunkirk evacuation unfolded, German forces continued operations across France. Belgium surrendered on May 28 after days of fierce fighting and heavy civilian casualties. With the northern pocket collapsing and Dunkirk's perimeter shrinking with each passing hour, the broader French defensive situation deteriorated rapidly. German forces repositioned for the next phase of the campaign, Fall Rot, aimed at crushing the remaining French army and compelling the French government to capitulate. The collapse of the Northern Allied front after the evacuation from Dunkirk marked a decisive shift in the operational and moral landscape of the spring campaign of 1940. The French army, though still fielding substantial numbers of divisions, now faced the German Wehrmacht without the support of the British Expeditionary Force in the field, without the Belgian army anchoring its northern flank, and without the strategic depth provided by the Low Countries. The catastrophic disintegration of the Allied Northern Front forced France to confront the reality that the second phase of the German offensive, Fall Rot, would be fought under conditions overwhelmingly favorable to the German army. Historian accounts and official documents show that the French command, despite grave losses, sought to stabilize front lines along the Somme and Aisne rivers. Yet Germany, emboldened by the success of Fall Gelb and confident in its operational momentum, intended to break France's will to resist in a campaign characterized by relentless pressure, rapid armored spearheads, and the coordinated use of air power. In early June 1940, as the German High Command finalized preparations for Fall Rot, the strategic intent was clear: to destroy the remaining French field forces, cross France's principal defensive rivers, and seize key urban and industrial centers, including Paris, thereby forcing the French government to surrender. General Gerd von Rundstedt's Army Group A, responsible for the main offensive during Fall Gelb, would once again form the spearhead of operations. Army Group B, under General Fedor von Bock, would support the northern flank, while Army Group C tied down French forces along the Maginot Line. Germany's operational superiority in armor, mobility, and air power had already been demonstrated in dramatic fashion during the Ardennes breakthrough. The challenge now was to maintain tempo and deny France the opportunity to consolidate or reorganize its forces. French forces opposing the Germans along the Somme and Aisne rivers were exhausted, depleted and suffering from severe logistical shortages. The French High Command, now under General Maxime Weygand after Gamelin's removal, attempted to orchestrate a defensive reorganization known as the Weygand Line. This defensive concept relied on improvised positions, local reserves, and the hope that terrain features, combined with dogged resistance, might slow the German advance. Weygand's plan emphasized holding river lines, creating hedgehog-style defensive pockets in villages and towns, and launching localized counterattacks to disrupt German momentum. In theory, these measures could have bought time. In practice, the material and morale conditions of the French army made such resistance difficult to sustain. German operations for Fall Rot began on June 5, 1940 with a massive assault along the Somme. The attack opened with concentrated artillery barrages and heavy Luftwaffe strikes targeting French command posts, communication lines and defensive concentrations. The French positions, lacking sufficient anti-aircraft protection and already weakened by earlier fighting, suffered significant disruption. German infantry and armored divisions advanced rapidly, punching through the overstretched French lines in multiple sectors. At Péronne, German forces forced a crossing of the Somme, expanding their bridgeheads under constant air support. In the region near Aisne, the German offensive began on June 9, exploiting vulnerable sectors where French forces had been hastily redeployed after the collapse in the north. The coordinated movement of German armor and motorized infantry once again proved decisive. Despite pockets of fierce French resistance, particularly by colonial units and divisions reconstituted after retreating from Belgium, the German assault maintained its momentum. By June 10, German forces were pushing deep into the interior of France. The government of France, led by Premier Paul Reynaud, now faced immense pressure. Recognizing the dire military situation, Reynaud sought to persuade Britain to intensify joint resistance, including proposals for political union between the two nations, a desperate but sincere attempt to form a single Anglo-French polity capable of continuing the war even if France were overrun. The British government, though sympathetic, recognized that such a drastic step would not materially alter the immediate battlefield situation. Britain pledged continued air support and naval commitment but was unable to send fresh ground forces in significant numbers. The Royal Air Force contributed valuable but limited support to the French front, conducting ground attacks and defensive patrols, but the numbers were insufficient to change the course of the battle. By June 10, as the German offensive intensified, Italy declared war on France and Britain. Benito Mussolini, seeking territorial gains at minimal cost and believing France already defeated, committed Italian forces to attacks along the Franco-Italian border. These offensives achieved little militarily, as French Alpine units held their positions effectively. Yet the declaration of war compounded France's psychological burdens and reinforced the sense of encirclement. As German forces pushed southward, the French government evacuated Paris on June 10. The capital, officially declared an open city to prevent destruction, fell to German forces on June 14 without major resistance. The fall of Paris, while not in itself militarily decisive, since many battles had been lost before its occupation, carried enormous symbolic and psychological weight. Archival photographs and frontline reports depict Paris largely silent and subdued as German troops marched along its boulevards, a moment that encapsulated the profound crisis of the French Third Republic. Meanwhile, German forces continued their offensive across multiple fronts. The French army, though fighting with determination in many sectors, faced overwhelming odds. German armored divisions repeatedly exploited gaps, bypassed strongholds, and encircled defensive pockets. The Luftwaffe maintained air superiority, conducting strafing runs, bombing columns of retreating soldiers, and targeting infrastructure critical for French mobility. The loss of air control, combined with rapid German maneuvers, severely limited French operational flexibility. French counterattacks, though courageous and occasionally tactically effective, lacked the strategic coherence needed to halt the German advance. Units frequently found themselves isolated, lacking fuel, ammunition and coordination. The speed of the German assaults created a domino effect across defensive sectors. When one unit was forced to withdraw, adjacent units became exposed, triggering further retreats. The French High Command, unable to maintain stable lines, faced the grim reality that continued resistance would lead to the destruction of what remained of the French army. By mid-June, German forces were advancing toward the Loire River. Weygand briefed the government that no organized line of resistance could be established south of the Loire and that the French army was on the brink of operational collapse. The government, now led by Marshal Philippe Pétain after Reynaud's resignation on June 16, faced a momentous decision. Pétain, revered for his leadership during the First World War, believed further resistance would lead only to needless casualties and ruin. He announced his intention to seek an armistice. German forces continued advancing during the armistice negotiations. Rennes fell on June 18, and German units approached the Atlantic ports of Brest and Saint-Nazaire. These ports had become evacuation points for various Allied personnel, including Polish and Czech forces as well as remnants of British logistical units. German aircraft targeted these ports to prevent Allied withdrawal. The sinking of the RMS Lancastria on June 17 during the evacuation at Saint-Nazaire, resulting in thousands of fatalities, underscored the human cost of these desperate final days. As negotiations progressed, German forces also surrounded the remaining parts of the Maginot Line. Though these fortifications had held out for weeks, demonstrating the formidable defensive capabilities envisioned by their designers, they were now strategically irrelevant. German units maneuvered around the line, isolating the forts. Many forts surrendered between mid and late June after exhausting their supplies. Though the Maginot Line had fulfilled its narrow tactical role, it was rendered ineffective by the operational maneuver warfare Germany employed. On June 22, 1940, France signed the armistice with Germany in the Campine Forest, the same location where the German Empire had accepted the armistice of 1918. Adolf Hitler chose the site deliberately, seeking symbolic revenge. The terms of the armistice were harsh. France was divided into an occupied zone in the north and west, controlled directly by Germany, and an unoccupied zone in the south governed from Vichy under Pétain's regime. The French army was largely demobilized, its equipment seized, and its sovereignty severely curtailed. French naval forces, though initially allowed to remain under French control, became a point of tension between the new Vichy government and Britain, leading to tragic events later in 1940. The fall of France shocked the world. The German Wehrmacht had defeated one of Europe's major powers in just 6 weeks. The strategic implications were immense. Germany now controlled the Atlantic coastline from Norway to the Spanish border. The Low Countries were occupied. Britain stood alone in Western Europe. Yet Germany's victory created new strategic challenges. The British government, led by Prime Minister Winston Churchill, rejected any suggestion of negotiation or surrender. Britain's resolve to continue the war forced Germany to consider how to defeat an island nation protected by the Royal Navy and the English Channel. Hitler, though initially uncertain whether an invasion was necessary or feasible, ordered planning to begin for Operation Sea Lion, a cross-channel invasion designed to eliminate Britain as a base of resistance. The German High Command recognized that an invasion could not proceed unless the Luftwaffe gained air superiority over southern England. The Royal Air Force had to be neutralized, British radar stations destroyed, and fighter commands' airfields crippled. The Luftwaffe, which had played a crucial role in the victories in Poland, Norway and France, now faced a different kind of campaign, a sustained air offensive requiring the destruction of a determined and technologically advanced opponent defending its homeland. German preparations for the air campaign began in late June and early July 1940. Luftwaffe units redeployed to airfields along the French and Belgian coasts, while reconnaissance flights probed British defenses. German intelligence underestimated British aircraft production capabilities and the resilience of the RAF's command and control system. Experiences in France may have contributed to this misjudgment. The Luftwaffe had achieved rapid and overwhelming success against disorganized opponents on the continent. It now faced an adversary equipped with an integrated air defense network, radar stations, centralized command structures and fighter squadrons trained for rapid interception. Operation Sea Lion required the Luftwaffe to destroy or suppress British fighter command. Only then could the German Navy, at that time vastly inferior to the Royal Navy in capital ships, transport troops across the Channel without unacceptable losses. The German naval leadership viewed the invasion with skepticism, expressing concern over the vulnerability of troop transports and the logistical complexity of maintaining a foothold in Britain. Hitler, nevertheless, hoped that Britain might sue for peace before any invasion became necessary. When no such negotiation materialized, he authorized the Luftwaffe to proceed with preparations for air assault. British defensive preparations intensified throughout June and July. Recognizing the gravity of the situation, Churchill's government mobilized all available resources. The RAF accelerated pilot training programs, repaired damaged airfields and expanded aircraft production. Civil defense organizations prepared for air raids, and the British population braced for the coming assault. The survival of the nation depended on the success of its air defenses. The stage was now set for the Battle of Britain, the first major campaign fought entirely in the air. Its origins lay directly in the events of Fall Gelb and Fall Rot, which destroyed France's ability to resist and left Britain standing alone against a triumphant and territorially expanded Germany. The coming battle would test not only military capabilities but also national endurance. It would determine whether Germany could extend its domination of Western Europe across the Channel, or whether Britain would remain a defiant stronghold capable of sustaining the fight against tyranny. The fall of France and the rapid German conquest of Western Europe in the spring of 1940 reshaped the strategic situation in a manner unprecedented in modern European history. With the continent under German control from the Pyrenees to the Arctic Circle, Britain now stood as the final bastion against Nazi domination in the West. Hitler's strategic timetable, initially focused on consolidating gains and preparing for a long-term conflict against the Soviet Union, was disrupted by Britain's refusal to seek terms. Instead of accepting the collapse of France as final, the British government, strengthened politically and emotionally by Winston Churchill's leadership, signaled with clarity that the struggle would continue. This commitment forced Germany to seek a solution that would neutralize Britain as a military threat before turning to future ambitions. The result was a sequence of decisions and developments that culminated in the Battle of Britain, a campaign that would shape the future course of the war. The immediate strategic question after the armistice with France was whether Germany should attempt a direct invasion of Britain or rely on coercive measures, primarily through air power, to pressure the British government into capitulation. Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of southern England, was approved in principle. Yet from its inception, the operation faced immense logistical and operational obstacles. The Kriegsmarine had suffered significant losses earlier in the war, including in the battles for Norway, leaving it far inferior to the Royal Navy in large surface vessels. German naval commanders repeatedly expressed grave doubts about the feasibility of protecting slow-moving invasion barges against British destroyers, cruisers, and battleships, even if the Luftwaffe gained limited control of the skies. The Royal Air Force and its fighter command under Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding had prepared for such an eventuality long before the collapse of France. Britain possessed a fully integrated air defense system, the first of its kind in the world, linking radar stations, observer corps posts, centralized control rooms and dispersed fighter squadrons. This system allowed for efficient detection, tracking and interception of incoming enemy aircraft. The Chain Home Radar Network, stretching along the coast, provided early warning of Luftwaffe formations crossing the channel. Ground controllers then directed squadrons of Hurricanes and Spitfires to intercept the enemy at tactically advantageous points. This combination of technology, organization, and training provided Britain with a defensive capacity that Germany had not encountered during its earlier campaigns in Europe. As early as June 1940, the Luftwaffe began limited reconnaissance and probing attacks against Britain. These initial operations targeted shipping in the Channel, coastal installations and radar stations. German commanders sought to test British responses, assess reaction times and identify vulnerabilities in the RAF's defensive system. While these early raids were limited in scale, they marked the beginning of Germany's sustained effort to wear down fighter command. At this stage, Hitler still hoped that Britain might negotiate an end to hostilities without the need for a full-scale invasion. When diplomatic initiatives failed, the Luftwaffe received authorization to escalate operations. The Luftwaffe's strategic expectation was that it could destroy fighter command by overwhelming it with sustained bombing attacks on airfields, aircraft production centers and radar infrastructure. The air offensive that began in earnest in July 1940, known retrospectively as the Battle of Britain, can be divided into several distinct phases. Each phase reflected shifts in German strategy, British resilience, and the evolving tactical realities of air combat. The first phase, often referred to as the Kanalkampf, focused heavily on attacks against shipping in the English Channel. German aircraft targeted convoys, hoping to disrupt Britain's supply routes and lure RAF fighters into battle. British fighters engaged repeatedly, and the Luftwaffe sought to draw them into attritional combat under conditions favorable to German fighter escorts. Yet the Channel operations did not weaken fighter command significantly, nor did they compel Britain to reduce its defensive posture. Instead, they provided both sides with critical combat experience that shaped tactics in the weeks ahead. The second phase, beginning in early August 1940, marked the beginning of a broader air assault aimed at destroying fighter command directly. German bombers, escorted by Bf 109 fighters, targeted RAF airfields, radar stations and aircraft factories across southern England. These attacks intensified during Adler Tag, Eagle Day, on August 13, when the Luftwaffe launched one of its most extensive air operations. Despite the scale of the assault, British radar remained operational or was quickly repaired when damaged. RAF fighter squadrons, directed by Dowding's system, mounted effective interceptions. Though both sides suffered losses, fighter command maintained cohesion, and aircraft production in Britain continued at a pace that compensated for combat attrition. Throughout August, the Luftwaffe continued sustained pressure on RAF airfields, especially sector stations critical to fighter command's operational network. Airfields such as Biggin Hill, Kenley, Hornchurch and Debden experienced repeated attacks. Ground crews worked around the clock to repair runways, restore infrastructure and keep aircraft serviceable. The pressure was immense, and the RAF endured severe strain. Yet the structural advantages of the British defensive system, combined with effective squadron rotation and a steady supply of replacement pilots and aircraft, enabled fighter command to remain functional despite the intensity of German operations. German intelligence assessments, however, increasingly misjudged the state of fighter command. Luftwaffe commanders, influenced by optimistic reports from bomber crews and by the visible damage inflicted on airfields, concluded that RAF fighter strength was close to collapse. In reality, while the RAF faced critical moments, particularly in late August, the organization had not broken. The resilience of fighter command, combined with the Germans' incomplete understanding of the British air defense network, contributed to a pivotal shift in German strategy. The next phase of the Battle of Britain began in early September. After months of attacks on airfields and radar sites, the Luftwaffe shifted its focus toward bombing London and other major cities. This shift was partly motivated by German frustration with the perceived lack of progress in destroying fighter command and partly influenced by retaliatory impulses following a British bombing raid on Berlin in late August. Hitler demanded reprisals, and Göring redirected the Luftwaffe's effort toward the bombing of civilian population centers. This new phase, known as the Blitz, would continue for many months, but its immediate effect was to relieve pressure on the RAF's airfields at the most critical moment of the battle. By diverting bombing operations away from fighter command's vital infrastructure, Germany inadvertently provided the RAF with time to repair damaged installations, reorganize squadrons and rebuild operational capacity. While the human cost in London and other cities was immense, with thousands killed and wounded, the shift in German strategy had profound military implications. Civilian casualties, though tragic and deeply felt across British society, did not contribute to the destruction of fighter command, which remained intact and growing stronger with each passing week. As German bombers now flew deeper into British airspace to reach London, they encountered longer flight times, increased exposure to British defences and greater fatigue among crews. RAF fighters could engage them over a wider area and with greater tactical freedom. The result was a series of intense aerial battles throughout early and mid-September. On September 15, Fighter Command repelled one of the largest German raids of the campaign in what became known as Battle of Britain Day. The scale of British interceptions and the visible losses suffered by the Luftwaffe undermined German confidence in the feasibility of achieving air superiority. By late September, German losses had mounted significantly. The Luftwaffe, though capable of continued bombing operations, was no closer to destroying fighter command than it had been at the beginning of the campaign. With the autumn weather deteriorating, and with no prospect of neutralizing the RAF before the end of the favorable invasion season, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely on September 17. The invasion was never revitalized. The Battle of Britain did not end abruptly. German bombing operations continued through the autumn and winter of 1940 to 1941. The Blitz inflicted severe destruction on British cities, including London, Coventry, Liverpool, Birmingham and many others. Tens of thousands of civilians were killed, and cultural landmarks were lost. Yet British industrial production, civil administration and national morale survived the onslaught. The failure of the Luftwaffe to break Britain's resistance ensured that the United Kingdom remained an active participant in the war, a staging ground for future Allied operations, and a symbol of defiance against tyranny. The consequences of Germany's defeat in the Battle of Britain extended far beyond the immediate tactical and operational outcomes. Germany's inability to secure air superiority prevented the invasion of the British Isles, ensuring that Britain remained a sovereign base from which the Allies could eventually launch the liberation of Europe. The strategic defeat also represented the first major German failure of the war, undermining the aura of invincibility that had accompanied the Wehrmacht since 1939. The setback forced Hitler to reconsider his strategic priorities, contributing to his decision to turn east toward the Soviet Union in 1941, a decision that would have profound implications for the course of the conflict. Britain's survival after the fall of France also ensured the continuation of the broader Allied coalition. The persistence of British resistance encouraged the exiled governments of occupied European nations, sustained the morale of resistance movements emerging on the continent, and provided a focal point for American support prior to the United States' entry into the war. Through programs such as Lend-Lease, the United States supplied Britain with vital materials, aircraft, and equipment. These links forged during the bleak months of 1940 would grow into the global alliance that ultimately defeated Nazi Germany. Looking back, the events of 1940 form a continuous and interconnected narrative. The rapid German offensives of Fall Gelb and Fall Rot, the collapse of France, the evacuation at Dunkirk, and the Battle of Britain represent stages in a singular strategic struggle, one in which the balance of power in Europe shifted dramatically and unpredictably. The German breakthrough at Sedan, achieved through bold operational innovation, sealed the fate of the French Third Republic. The encirclement of Allied forces in northern France created the conditions for Dunkirk, both a disaster and a miracle of evacuation. The collapse of the French army left Britain standing alone. And yet, through technological innovation, organizational foresight, industrial resilience and national determination, Britain resisted the most powerful air force in Europe. The Luftwaffe's failure to destroy Fighter Command marked a turning point in the war. It proved that Germany, despite its impressive military achievements, could be stopped. It demonstrated that morale, preparation and strategic clarity could overcome even the most formidable adversary. It preserved a base from which future operations, from the North African campaigns to the Normandy landings, would ultimately bring about the liberation of Europe. The Spring Offensive of 1940 and the subsequent battle over Britain remain among the most intensively studied periods in military history. They reveal the dramatic consequences of strategic decisions, the power of technological innovation, and the immense sacrifices made by servicemen and civilians alike. Archival documents, combat reports, eyewitness accounts and official histories consistently reinforce the same fundamental truth, that the outcome of these months shaped the destiny of nations and the direction of the world. Through the lens of history, one can see the endurance of those who fought in the skies over Britain, the courage of those who manned the radar stations, repaired the airfields, and kept the aircraft flying, and the unwavering resolve of the citizens who endured the Blitz with steadfastness. Their collective efforts ensured that Britain survived the darkest year of the war. And with Britain unbroken, the struggle for Europe continued, a struggle that would, in time, turn against the aggressor and restore freedom to the continent.